This is part 2 in an 8-part series from the book of Ruth called Backstory. To accompany this series, I've created what I call the Ruth Challenge Journal. We've got some copies in the back. They're also available online. This document provides some space for you to take notes during this series. It also allows you to track your progress on the 4 challenges that I'm issuing each week during the series. Helpfully summarized by the word Ruth are: read the entire book of Ruth one time each week. It'll take you about 15 minutes. You uncover the way in which some of what you're reading in Ruth is showing up in your life through some self-reflection. T, transcribe, that is, handwrite 10 to 11 verses from Ruth each week. By the end of the series, you will have handwritten the entire book of Ruth. And in so doing, you'll notice some things that you might have missed otherwise. And then H, heed one invitation from the message each week. At the end of each message in this series, I'll provide 2 or 3 different invitations, things for you to do during the week. And so just pick one of those and lean into it during that week. This second message focuses on a faith crisis that takes place in what is this backstory of Jesus. As I noted in the first part of this 8-part series, Ruth is the backstory to the story of Jesus. The child of Ruth, the grandson of Naomi, is an ancestor of Jesus. And so we get to peer back into the story of Jesus, and we get to see the ways in which God was active in the ordinary, the common, the routine of that backstory. And so it allows us to reflect on the ways in which God is active in our own backstories, in our own routine and common experiences of life. And as part of that backstory, we find a faith crisis. The book shows us a very difficult moment in the life of Naomi, where she seems to be wrestling deeply with her own faith and enduring a crisis of faith. And as such, it resonates with many of us because throughout history, people of faith have wrestled with faith. Brian McLaren is the author of a book called Do I Stay Christian?, where he tries to work through the many different reasons why people, even today, of Christian faith, might be asking that question, well, do I stay Christian? Because they're wrestling with that faith. One of the reasons that he gives that some might be wrestling with their Christian faith has to do with the anti-Semitism present in Christian history. That is, some people look at Christian history and they see some of the ways in which Christians have mistreated or neglected Jewish people, and it makes them question the validity of their own Christian faith. Or others, McLaren writes, question the validity of their Christian faith because of patriarchy and the way in which women have been neglected or mistreated or abused in Christian history. And it leads some people, even today, to wonder, is this a faith that I want to hold on to? Or another reason that McLaren points to in this book is the way that some Christian institutions or Christian people have used or misused money and other resources. And it leads people to wonder, is that the kind of faith that I want to hold on to? The book of Ruth reveals that our backstories may include faith crises like these. Things that leave us with a bitter taste in our mouth when it comes to God. A bitter taste in our mouths when it comes to God's people. And as such, the book of Ruth helps normalize this for us. If you're enduring a faith crisis, if there's a bitter taste in your own mouth about some elements of the Christian faith, that's okay. because it was part of the backstory of Jesus. It shows up in the book of Ruth, and it's very likely going to be a part of our own backstories as well. So in verses 3 through 5 of chapter 1, we note the events that lead to this crisis of faith, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. We might remember from the first message in the series that Naomi and her family have fled their own country, Judah, because a famine has made it difficult to survive there, and they've relocated to Moab, where they now live as refugees. And there is a mixed experience there for Naomi and her family. On the one hand, the family grows. Her sons find Moabite women and get married. They seem to have resources that they didn't have in Judah and are able to survive there in Moab. But on the other hand, Naomi experiences tremendous tragedy. Her husband dies, her sons die, and she's left with just 2 daughters-in-law. And this experience has a profound impact on Naomi and a profound impact on her faith experience. And so in verse 13 and then 19 through 21, we see how she interprets this event. Because there are the bad things that happen to us, and then there are the ways that we interpret the bad things that happen to us. So notice how Naomi begins to interpret what's happened to her. "No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." So the 2 of them, Naomi and Ruth, went on until they came to Bethlehem in Judah. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" The loss of her husband, the loss of her sons, has so impacted her that when she returns to her country, Judah, in Bethlehem with Ruth, Naomi says, "It's time for a name change. No longer call me Naomi," which means sweet, but now call me Mara, which means better. This tragedy has so impacted her that she can no longer even think of herself in the same way. Her life has been so impacted that her core identity is now bitter. And notice who she blames for the bitterness. 5 times she blames the Lord. "It is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. The Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. The Lord has brought me back empty. The Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me." There's what happens to you, and there's the way you interpret what happens to you. And 5 times Naomi says, "This is God's fault. This is God's fault. This is God's fault. This is God's fault. This is God's fault." And it's not just what happens to her. It's this interpretation that leads her now to be embittered. One of the things that the book of Ruth explores for us is the way in which we can move from being Naomi and experiencing the sweetness of life to being Mara and being embittered with life by doing two things: denouncing God as the source of bad things and disregarding God as the source of the beautiful things in life. Naomi has mistakenly denounced God as the source of this tragedy in her life. There is nothing else in the story of Ruth to suggest that the God of the book of Ruth is remotely involved in arbitrarily killing husbands and sons. Instead, everything else in the book of Ruth points to a God who is deeply invested in bringing good and beautiful and sweet things into the lives of his people. Naomi has mistakenly denounced God as the source of the bad things in her life. And at the same time, she has mistakenly disregarded God as the source of the good things in her life. And it's those two things that lead her to be embittered. Let me explain even more. In the 85 verses that make up the book of Ruth, there are 22 times when we find one of the words for God. The vast majority of those times, 20 of those 22 times, when a word for God appears in the book of Ruth, it is in the mouth of someone else who is saying something about God. So, for example, one of those times occurs in chapter 2, and we'll look at this in more detail later in the series. But in chapter 2, a man named Boaz does something very kind for Ruth, and Ruth tells Naomi about that kindness, and Naomi praises God for what Boaz has done. And Naomi says that what Boaz has done shows us that God has not forsaken the living or the dead. There's a moment where Naomi gets it. She clearly sees that this beautiful thing that's happened in her life is a result of the work of God. But there are other times when she doesn't get it. So there are 2 times in the book of Ruth when a word for God appears from the hand of the narrator. There's a narrator who is telling this story to us. And twice it's the narrator who tells us something about God. One of those times happens in chapter 1 and verse 6. And the narrator tells us that some people are telling Naomi that God has ended this famine back in Judah. That God has brought that suffering to an end, and there's now provision for the people of God. So chapter 1 verse 6 says, "For she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food." She's told this beautiful thing that God has done, but she essentially disregards it. There's no moment of praise and celebration for her. She disregards this beautiful thing that God has done. And then the other time that a word for God appears from the hand of the narrator comes at the end of the book. At the end of the book, Ruth has a son. Naomi has a grandson. And the narrator tells us this beautiful birth is the result of the work of God. And the Lord gave her, Ruth, conception. And she bore a son, and the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." And the interesting thing about that is, all the way back in chapter 1, there's no way that Naomi, embittered, could know that that's what God was going to do. But that's the kind of God the narrator tells us about in the book of Ruth. So Naomi does credit God for the kindness of Boaz in chapter 2, but she fails to credit God for the end of the famine in chapter 1. She faults God for the loss of her family, and she remains ignorant to the way in which the God of this story is going to work all things out and bring about a new birth, a new life, a new hope into the narrative. And it's all of that that contributes to her being Mara. And it's often these very two same things that lead us into crises of faith, that lead us to move from experiencing life as sweet to experiencing life as bitter. Sometimes we are too certain about the bad that God has done in our lives or our world, when in reality, it's far less than we might ever imagine. And sometimes we are too uncertain about the beautiful things that God is doing in our world, which is far more than we might ever imagine. It's not just the things that happen to us. It's the way that we interpret those things that leads us to experience the bitterness of being Mara. And so the book of Ruth holds out hope and suggests that there's a way out of this. There are many ways to go from being Naomi to Mara, but there are also some ways to go from being Mara to being Naomi. There are ways to move out of bitterness back into sweetness. Number one, by declining to attribute the bitter things to God. What if we just made a decision for the next week that we would not attribute bad and bitter things to God? What if we just decide, I'm going to give God the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to believe the very best about God. And whatever the tragedy is, whatever the crisis is, whatever the bitter thing is, let's decline to attribute that to God. I think if you will spend a week doing that, you'll find life tasting much sweeter. And second, decide. Decide to spend a week attributing the things in your past, the things in the present, and the things that could happen in the future to God. Whatever good and beautiful things happen around you this week, make a decision right now to attribute those things to God. Because that's what the narrator of this story is doing. And even if you move through this week and for some strange reason there's no good and beautiful thing happening around you, make a decision right now to believe that the God of the story of Ruth is also the God of your life. And unbeknownst to you, unseen by you, that same God is working toward your future to bring about new life and new hope. Because that's really what the book of Ruth is about. It's about this arc of a God who is constantly involved behind the scenes without visions and miracles, but hard at work, moving from death to new life, moving from loss to gain, moving from despair to hope. It's a story that ends with the birth of a brand new baby. Could you make a decision right now to believe that even if somehow you went through this next week without good and beautiful things happening, could you make a decision right now to believe that there's nonetheless a God who is working toward a future where there are good and beautiful things? those two decisions could lead to a far sweeter life for you. Kate Bowler is a Duke Divinity professor. In 2015, she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And at one point, she was in an interview talking about her experience, and she said this. She said, "A friend of mine always says, the middle is not the end." And I love that, she says. We want to fill in the end of the story all the time. And it's really kind of gotten me to realize how much fuzziness we normally have in our lives when we make narrative arcs. The middle is not the end. That was one of the mistakes, I believe, that Naomi made. Caught up here in chapter 1 in this terrible tragedy, to her it felt like the end. Just go ahead and change my name. That's all that I am from this point forward. And what the narrator is telling us is no. This is the middle. This is not the end. Because the end that God is working toward in your life, Mara, is an end filled with beauty and good. At the end of each of these messages, I'll offer some invitations. Let me list these 3 and ask you in this moment right now to consider which of these resonate with you, which of these might you lean into this week. So number 1, list 2 or 3 beautiful things that have happened in your life that years prior to them, you had little to no idea that those things were going to happen. And then give thanks to God for them. Or number 2, list 2 to 3 hard or heavy things happening in your life or your world right now. And with each one of those, repeat 5 times in contrast to what Naomi did. This is not God's fault. 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 Or number 3, provide 2 or 3 answers to each of these questions. What are some things I really don't know about God that I sometimes act like I do? And what are some things I really do know about God that sometimes I act like I don't? Which of those resonate with you? Which of those might you lean into this week?